Naaman was the commander of the army of the king of Aram, and he was a great man and in high favor with his master, though he did not know that it was because of the Lord that he had been given victories to Aram. This man, though a mighty warrior, suffered from leprosy. Now the Arameans on one of the raids had taken a young girl captive from the land of Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. And she said to her mistress, "If only my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." So Naaman went in and told his king just what the girl from the land of Israel had said, and the king of Aram said to him, "Go then, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel." And he went, taking with him 10 talents of silver and 6,000 shekels of gold and 10 sets of garments. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, "When this letter reaches you, know that I have sent my servant Naaman, that you may cure him of his leprosy." When the king of Israel read this letter, he tore his clothes and he said, "Am I God to give death or life, that this man sends word to me to cure another man of leprosy? Just look, he is trying to pick a fight with me." But when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent a messenger to the king and said, "Why have you torn your clothes? Send him to me, that he may learn that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman came with his horses and his chariots, and he halted at the entrance to Elisha's house, and Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go, wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." But Naaman became angry and went away, saying, "I thought that for me he would surely come out and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, and he would wave his hand over the spot, and he would cure me of the leprosy. Are not the Abana and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than the waters of Israel? Can I not wash in them and be clean?" And he turned and he went away in a rage. But his servants approached him and said, "Father, if the prophet had commanded you to do something difficult, would you not have done it? How much more when all he said to you was wash and be clean?" So Naaman went down, and he immersed himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a young man. He was clean. Then he returned to the man of God, he and all of his company. He came and he stood before him, and he said, "Now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. When we in the West speak of histories, we demand exact dates. We want exact quotes. We want to see schematics and objective relationships to facts. But the way we approach history is new. In the tradition of the ancient rabbis of Israel, the objectivity of history was not as important as the narrative arc of history. These rabbis were not afraid of the gaps in the stories, of the places of silence, because those places of silence became places of speculation. And into those spaces of silence and speculation, they would tell stories. The word for it is a midrash. And a midrash is a story that you create to fit into the silence of what a story does not say. And the midrash helps to illuminate the ways that God might be working in the life of his people. To put it in the vernacular, a midrash is ancient fan fiction about the Bible. A midrash is a holy what if. And this morning, I would like to share with you mine. General Naaman was stripped down to the waist and standing next to the muddy waters of the Jordan. Several paces behind him, his fine clothing lay draped over the side of a richly adorned chariot. His purebred horses were stamping impatiently in the heat of the day, and his military entourage was quietly ignoring the scene in front of them, either looking at the horizon behind them or studiously at their feet. Because General Naaman was stripped down to his waist, standing next to the muddy waters of the Jordan River, and alternately he would look up and glare at the house of Elisha. This was not how Naaman had expected his day to turn out. The last time General Naaman had been in this territory, it had been in a battle in which his forces had killed the king of Israel. The last time General Naaman had been in this territory, it had been as a conqueror, as a man of power, as a winner. And this time, he was here at the word of a slave girl. He had had to beg for help from the son of the king he had killed. And at the word of that cowardly king, he had ended up at the door of a prophet of a god he did not worship. And now, at the word of the prophet's servant and one of his slaves, he was standing next to this damned muddy Jordan, stripped to the waist. This was not how his life should have turned out. Once General Naaman had been sure of the ways that the world worked. Power opened doors. Wealth opened minds, and influence made anything possible. He had climbed the ranks of soldiers. He had played politics with the wise and the naive. He had made a name for himself despite the predictions of all of his foes. Once General Naaman had been sure of the way that the world worked, and then a disease had ravaged him, and nothing worked the way it should. For as long as he could manage, he had hidden his sickness, but even his wife's slave girl had noticed that the works of all his magicians and healers had failed. He had never expected his hard-won power and position to fail him so spectacularly. He had come back to this forsaken land with the edict of the king on his behalf. He had come with wealth and the threat of retribution like dark wings behind him. He had come in need, but he had also come with his pride. But as swiftly as the king of Israel revealed himself to be a fool with no answers, it became clear that his power and his pride meant nothing here. The prophet he had traveled hundreds of miles and days to see wouldn't even come out of his house. He was the mighty general of the armies of Aram, and apparently all that warranted him was a servant daring to command him to wash in a river that might as well be a toilet. Who could have expected General Naaman to be humbled by a slave? Certainly not Naaman. Nothing in his life had prepared him for this moment. Stripped of his wealth, stripped of his power, stripped of even his pride, vulnerable and at the mercy of a God he didn't even worship. And now his disease was laid bare to slaves and soldiers alike, and there was nothing left for him to do. Nothing left for him to do except what he had been commanded to do. So General Naaman waded out into a muddy river, a river that was nothing compared to the rivers of Damascus, and he kneeled, and he let the water buffet him, and he held his breath, and he went under once. His palms touched the riverbed, and behind tightly clenched eyes, he saw a vision of vast darkness being shaped. Light and earth and sky and sea suddenly springing forth, and a voice whispered to him, "Naaman." And Naaman burst forth from the waters, unsure of what he had seen or heard, and so he held his breath, and he went under again, and his palms touched the riverbed, and he was suddenly within different waters. Surrounded by beasts and fish he did not have names for, their numbers increasing, a torrent impossible to know, all spilling forth from a power too bright to look at, and a voice whispered again, "Naaman only." He gasped as his head broke out of the water, his heart beating wildly. What was this place? But he held his breath again, and he went under again, and again his palms touched the riverbed, and this time he saw a man and his family upon a great ship. Lonely figures in an endless sea, endless rain bearing upon them, and the voice was stronger this time, "Naaman, only mine." He surfaced again, but he knew he was drowning in mysteries. He held his breath, and he went under again, and his palms touched the riverbed, and he saw a vision of hundreds of thousands of people crossing a dry seabed with walls of water held up on either side, a mighty army rushing behind him, and the voice came from every direction and from none, "Naaman, only my power." Naaman forgot to worry about how foolish he appeared, his mouth agape as he rose up again, and he descended into muddy waters once more, his palms touching the riverbed, and he had a vision of an old man striking a rock with a staff and water bursting forth, a new river in a dry desert. The voice was an avalanche, "Naaman, only my power will." Had he always been in this river? Breath and water and mud under his nails? He rose again, he held his breath, he went under, his palms touched the riverbed, and he saw men holding aloft a golden ark in the middle of a river. Waters stopped on either side as people walked into a promised land, and the voice was like a bell pealing inside him, "Naaman, only my power will never." The prophet's servant had said, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored." So a 7th time he held his breath, and he went under the surface of this river, his palms touching the bottoms, and this time he saw nothing and felt everything. Heat and cold, pain and pleasure, grief and joy, and a voice clearly saying, "Naaman, only my power will never fail." Naaman's servant watched from beside a chariot, counting silently each time the general submerged, and rose again. At 5, he began to walk forward, ready to meet him at this river bank, ready to see skin still mottled by disease, ready to leave this land and try to find another healer in another place. But General Naaman rose up out of the water a 7th time, and the servant stopped and almost dropped the shoes in his hands. The general was impossibly healed. Naaman stood in the waters for what was both mere moments and an eternity. He stood still and he gazed down at his body, at the places that had been scourged and now were like that of a young man. He stood still, bare to the waist, stripped of everything, given everything. He stood still, and then he stalked out of the river, his servants and his entourage trailing silently behind him, wide-eyed, and he approached the door of the prophet, and Elisha stood in his doorway, though no one was ever really sure when he had come out of his house. he watched Naaman, stripped and soaked, come to stand in front of him. And Elisha just waited. And Naaman stared at him and then said something that a powerful general from Aram should never say. Now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. It seems that in the waters of the Jordan, General Naaman had been humbled and made whole. My friends, all of us come to crossroads like this, when we realize that all of our power and its attendant privilege, all of our influence and our wealth eventually fails us. Whether it is at the bedside of a beloved father dying of cancer despite all our efforts on his behalf, whether it is in a hotel banquet hall after we have lost an election that we were expected to win, whether it is holding the phone in our hands after being told we didn't get a job we called in all of our favors for, whether it is being asked to let someone else lead in our place in the PTA, in the Rotary Club, in the Neighborhood Watch, or in the church, we end up like Naaman, eventually, stripped of all of our illusions, of all of our power, and all our pride. But that is actually good news. Because when we are humbled beyond our own belief, God meets us. God in Jesus, like Chad read today, poured out all of his power, stripped himself of all of his majesty and pride, and literally waded out into the Jordan as well. In truth, we are not asked to do more than God in Jesus was willing to do. Learning to set aside all that we think we need. We need to let go. We need to let go of all that which makes us feel powerful and safe, but which actually is neither. We have to learn to let it all go. To lay ourselves bare before the God who loves us, the God whose power is the only power that never fails. We have to strip ourselves of power. We have to be humbled, because that's the only way we are made whole.